In this video, we're going to actually start looking at some of the controls you can actually place on your forms. For a long time in the early days, there were basically three types of text input that we used for everything. Before we had select lists and radio buttons and all that, they were a single line text input, a password input, and a multi-line input controls. We'll look at each one of those individually here in just a minute. With the new HTML5, there are several new controls which are listed here. Color, be able to pick a color, a date, email, validation, making sure that it's strictly a number, range, things like that. These are all new controls for the input element in HTML5. We'll take a look at a couple of these later on, but most of these we're not going to look at specifically, but I encourage you to play with and see exactly how they work and what they do in your own browser. The single line text input is generated using an input element, and that's a self-contained or empty element, so there's no closing tag. And you set the type attribute of that input then to text, as you see here. That creates a text box. A name attribute is required. ID won't work in this case. It has to be name, and that attribute becomes part of the name value pair that's being sent to the server. The value is not mandatory that you actually place in the input tag as an attribute. It can be. If it's there, it provides the initial value. So it's like preloading it with something, maybe a template for a phone number or how you want them to submit their phone number. If it's not there, when the form is actually submitted, it takes whatever is in that text box and assigns that to the value. And that's how you get the name value pair. It has a size attribute as well, which just enables you to specify the width of the input controls. Basically, you would set it to a number like 20, and that would allow it, the size of it, to hold 20 characters. So take a look at an example of a form with an input. Here's our form. See, it's a container tag. Our input, and you can see that there is no closing tag, and the type then is text. We've given it a name according to our naming convention, which is spelled out in the coding standards document on the blackboard on the course. And it also has a value, which is search for, so this will be displayed as soon as we load this. And it also has a size, which means it'll hold up to 20 characters. So if we take a look at this in our browser, you'll see then that we do have our text box. That size of 20 dictated that this would be 20 characters wide, and with a value of search for, we have that automatically populated in there. As soon as the user replaces this, then whatever they replace it with, in this case replaces, becomes the value when it's submitted. So this, anything the user types in there would overwrite whatever value you had in there, such as the search for. You can also set the max length attribute. This enables you to control how many characters would actually be allowed to be typed in. And then you have a placeholder attribute, which is new with HTML5, but it represents a short hint that displays as the initial value. So in this sample we had max length in it, which would control it so that it would only allow 64 characters in there. I'm going to change this just for demonstration, change this to 30. Make sure I save it. And when we refresh this in our browser, you can see the sizes there. As we type in here, as soon as I get to 30 characters, which I've reached, I can't type anymore. Notice also that everything scrolled from right to left so that you could see it. You could then scroll back and change things if need be. It's scrollable either way, but it's limited now to 30 characters. No matter how many times I press on these keys, nothing's going to enter in there. If we change the value to placeholder, and it's so new that Notepad++ doesn't recognize it, save that, refresh our window again, you see that we still have the search for in here, but if you look closely, you'll notice that it's kind of grayed out. It's not the solid black that it was before because it's now a placeholder. As soon as I click in here and type anything, it all disappears and you start to enter whatever value it is you want in there. The big advantage of this placeholder is that it doesn't act as the value. So when you validate your form to check for the value, you don't have to see that it still says search form and then do something to either change it or put it back in the user's lap to actually enter something. If you had it as value and you didn't validate that in any way, that search for would actually be sent to the server as part of the name value pairs. Where here now, if this is not a required element and we submit it to the server for processing, the search for does not go. It would go with a name and an empty value because there's no value there. So the placeholder works as a way of giving them a hint without having to worry about that becoming the value. A password input control just masks the characters or that the users type it on the screen by replacing them with bullets. It's almost identical to the single line text input control. The only difference is that we're giving it the type of password and we're starting a prefix with PWD. Keep in mind that this does not in any way, shape, or form make that secure. It's still available for anybody to see in transmission. It's not secure. It's only secure from the viewpoint of nobody can stand over your shoulder and read your password. Then the multi-line. What if you needed more information for like comments or messages that somebody might type? Well, we use the TextArea element for that. Now, TextArea is a container element. So unlike the input, it has an opening and closing tag, and actually what's between that is the value that will be sent to the server. So if we look at an example of this, you'll see if I hit TextArea, you'll see that it has an opening and closing tag, and then the content is what's between those tags. So if we were to look at this in our browser, we would see something like this. Notice all the space in the beginning here. You might be wondering, well, why isn't that all the way over to the left like that, like this is now? Well, the reason for that is, just like I said before, this is all content. Everything from the opening tag to the closing tag is its value. So this is one time when I don't expect you to align the opening and closing tags like you normally would. When you're doing text areas, you should have everything on one line. Even if there's no value, you still want it on one line because even without a value in there, the starting point would be over in the middle somewhere. So when you do a text area, make sure that there is no space between the opening and closing tag. The only thing that should be in between these would be any content that you want to preload it with. The text area comes with a name that you'll have to have. We're using the prefix of TextArea to signify that it's a text area. It has a row attribute and a column attribute, which are important. The row number indicates how many rows the element will be, and the column how many characters can you get on one line that's visible, just like what we saw in the size for the input, the text input. So if you look at this, you'll see that we have 20 rows and 50 columns. Well, that means that in here you'll be able to see 50 characters across this, and there will be 20 rows down to it. So that determines the size, if you will, of a text area. Now that doesn't restrict it, just like the size did not restrict the amount of content you could put into a text area. The rows and columns do not predefine a number of characters either. Once you fill all 20 rows with 50 characters, it just automatically creates a scroll bar and starts scrolling up, so you can continue to enter data in there. There is also a max length for a text area, just like we saw for the text. An autofocus, which is also available for the text box, which is a boolean that indicates that the element should have focus when the page loads. And that's a new attribute. Another new attribute is the required. That's a boolean that indicates whether the input is a required element or not, whether it has to be filled out. That's good for the text area as well. The placeholder, which you just saw with the text area, works. It simplifies a sample view of what the users might want to put in there, a hint to them of some sort. The direction name attribute's another new one. It provides a name for the text directional hint, whether it's reading or writing from right to left or left to right as we do. The wrap attribute, which I'll talk about here in just a few minutes in a little bit more detail, but that just determines how the lines wrap within the actual text box itself or text area itself. Disabled, which is a boolean attribute that disables the select box, preventing the user from intervention. The form attribute, which indicates the association of a form element for the text area. The value would actually be the ID of the associated form, not the name, but the ID. And in most cases, the ID and name are the same, but you would have to specify the ID. Read-only attribute indicates whether the user can edit the form field. And we'll take a closer look at the comparison between disabled and read-only a little bit later in the video or the next video. The text area also can take all the universal attributes that we talked about in the previous video. The wrap attribute that I talked about, it can take 3 possible values. The book only has 2, but there is a third one which is just off. The default is soft, so if you don't designate the wrap attribute, it's going to be soft, which means that whenever the text wraps, the user sees it on a new line. But it's transmitted to the server as if it was all one line. Okay? So even though it wraps to another line, when it goes to the server is going to see it as one huge gigantic line. However, if the user presses the enter key, it would be treated as a line break, and that would be sent to the server as well, that line break would. The hard means that whenever the text wraps, it's transmitted to the server as a new line. So it would just automatically, whether you hit enter or not, every line would be treated as a new line, and a new line character or a line break character would be inserted in there as it's being sent to the server. Off just tells the text area to ignore it, and then at that point it's no different than the text. It's just going to be one line, and it's going to scroll off to the right as you type and go over the number of columns. As I mentioned before, there are several new input types or controls as well as new attributes, and support for most of these are available in the latest versions of the major browsers. The Safari, the Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, things along those lines. But they're not all supported by them. So a browser treats any input with an unknown type as a type of text, which means that you can still collect data even if the specific enhancement, the user interface enhancement provided by the new inputs aren't available. Browsers ignore any elements or attributes that they don't understand. So they understand the input but wouldn't understand the type of, let's say, color. Therefore, it would just treat it as a text box and the person could type in the color. There are what are called polyfills, which are nothing more than small libraries, usually written in JavaScript, that provide support for new features in older browsers. And this website here, the Modernizer website or project, keeps track of all those. The book has a couple of them that it refers to, but you can see them and go to this website, the Modernizer website. It's a good place to go to find some scripts that would help you over that. So if we look at example 5 here, you'll see that we have a plain text box. We have one of the new ones, a telephone. We have a new email. These two just validate those as being a telephone or an email. We have the color in there, and we also have a date in there. Now, none of these actually are supported by Firefox. So if we view this in Firefox, you'll see that they're all just treated as text boxes. However, if we were to look at this in Chrome, you can see that they're actually being treated. And so the favorite color that we talked about earlier, see when you click on that, you can choose whatever colors you want and get very specific. You could even type in the RGB color that you want. You can pick from basic colors or get into it. So you can see how that works. As far as the date, this is kind of a nice one too. When you click into this and try to set a date, it'll validate it, or you can use the date picker and actually then just choose whatever date you want to have inserted in there, which is a nice tool to have. But again, in Firefox, that doesn't work. So you'd want to check to make sure and that it's working in the browsers that you want as far as these new HTML5 controls, and plan accordingly on your validation based on that, which is something that you'll be talking about later, much later in this course and in other courses. The placeholder, we pretty much described that and showed you how that works. It saves a lot of time of having to write a script to check that the value in there is not what you put in there as a template, but rather it's an actual value. The placeholder, you're not even dealing with that. So, and you can add that again using placeholder.js project, which is mentioned in the book on where you can get it, but you can actually get the script that would update all the older browsers so that they work just as if they understood the placeholder. There is a autocomplete attribute that we talked about. Setting that allows the web authors to control whether form entries should be cached or not. So as they type different things in, you've probably been on different sites and it automatically shows you samples of things. Google uses something like this for when you start typing in something you want to search for. But it allows you to be able to let the user see those things and choose from them. It has one of two values. It's either on or it's off. On indicates that the values are safe to save and pre-populate. Off indicates that they shouldn't be used. And later on, actually the next video, we'll look at using autocomplete with a data list as well that will allow you to predefine some possible values very similar to what a select box is. The required, again, that would make it so that whatever they're typing in that text box, that they actually do type something in. Want to be sure that they do that. And then there are buttons. There are several types of buttons that you can add. Buttons are the most common way of submitting a form. They are sometimes used to clear or reset the form, or even to trigger client-side scripts that you want to run. There's 3 ways that you can create a button. 2 of them require the input. You use the input element and set the type attribute to either submit, reset, or button. Or you could use the input with a type whose value is also image. It's a little bit different. You don't see this one too often, but it's a possible choice for you. Or you could use the button element itself. If you're doing it with the input, which is the most common way, the type of button you create is specified with the type attribute, as we've seen for everything else. If the value is submit, it creates a button that submits a form when pressed. If the value is reset, it creates a button that automatically resets the form controls to their initial values as they were when the page loaded. So if something had values, preset values in it, those values are going to be there. It's not going to clean it of all values. It's going to reset it to the exact way it was when it first loaded. And the button value allows you then to actually set a client-side script to run when the user clicks that button. So in a sample then you can see we have all three of those. Here's our submit button, here's our reset button, and this button is actually going to call a function which we don't have defined here, but when it's clicked it's going to run a function in JavaScript called calculate. Common attributes that you would use to create buttons using the input: the type, obviously, that specifies whether you want submit, reset, or button. The name, again, this provides the name for the button, but you really only need to add the name attribute to a button if there is more than one button on the same form. It is considered, though, good practice to give the button a name anyway to provide an indication of what the button does. The value actually is what is on the button itself. So it is what the button says. If a name attribute is given, the value of the value attribute is sent to the server as part of the name value pair, just like any other control. If no value is given, then no name pair value is sent to the browser or to the server. So the name and value of a button only gets sent to the server if the name attribute is there. Also, if you don't use the value attribute on the submit button, you'll find that different browsers decide to display different things on it. It could say submit, it could say query here, start query, it could say anything. So it's a good idea to give it a value. Doesn't have to have a name, but to give it a value so the button says exactly what you want it to say. Some new attributes for the type submit, reset, and button. Again, the autofocus, disabled, and the form that we looked at for the text area and the text box. An input with a type of submit, reset, or button can also take all the universal attributes that we've looked at. Using an image for a button. If you want to do that rather than using a standard button, you do that with setting the type equal to image. You would also then have to add a source just like you would for an image element so that it knows what image that it's going to use. So you're going to need to specify the source, the alt, what if that image doesn't load, the height, the width, just as you would for an image tag. This also supports disabled, form, form action, autofocus, form encrypt, form method, form target, and form validate attributes, as well as all the universal attributes. If the image button has a name attribute, the browser sends a name value pair. The name that you provide for the name attribute and the value will be the pair of XY coordinates for where the button was when the user actually clicked it. You could also create buttons using the button element. It's a more recent introduction and it enables you to specify what appears on a button between the opening and closing tag. So instead of the value being what the button says on it, it's what's between the opening and closing tag. You can include textual markup or image elements between these tags. Some browsers offer a relief or 3D effect on the button. It resembles an up and down motion when the button is clicked. Takes all the universal attributes, also supports the disabled, name, and autofocus. So you can see here then we've made the same submit, reset, and one that is just a button using the button element. Now, unless you're using an image that you want to do, or you want to be able to enhance, and you can see it here a little bit, enhance what is on that button. This has added a bold tag in there, so clear this form is going to be in bold, and then I want to start again, it'll just be in plain. But unless you're doing something like that, which you can see here on it, you can see how that's bold. Unless you're doing something like that, usually on a form I stick to the input types. And I use the button element because this button element can also be used without any form. So if it's a form, I usually use the inputs. If it's not a form, I use basically this last button here where I decide what I want to put in it, whether it's text or an image, but I then can control what goes in here, and at the same time I can do an on-click event in here to run some script. So if all I'm doing is running a script, I don't have to create a form just for the sake of having a button that's going to run the script. The next video will pick up on some more of the form controls, such as the checkbox, radio button, and select list, as well as take a look at the relationship or the differences between read-only and disabled, and that data list that I referred to for the auto select or autocomplete.